Did Canada and the USA ever come close to being one nation? How did Canada and the United States become separate countries? Let's find out with the help of Dan Snow's History Hit.
Why did the 13 colonies, and just the 13 colonies, rebel against the British Empire, break away, establish the USA, and why didn't they take all of the rest with them? That's the big question. Those American rebels in those 13 colonies, well, they thought that the rest of all of those British possessions should or would break away with them. As the 13 colonies declared their independence, they sent messages. They reached out to Nova Scotia and Canada and Florida, and they invited the people there to join the American Revolution. And there was some interest. Canada, in particular, if you look at the Articles of Confederation, so one of the sort of founding documents of this revolutionary republic, Canada was pre-approved for joining. Any other applicants would have to go through a process. Canada could just join. Boom, rubber stamped. There was some interest in joining, particularly in Nova Scotia, but ultimately, the areas that make up Canada today opted not to rebel. And that's a big moment. Why? Why did so much of British North America opt to stay within the British Empire? In those colonies, you had settlers who'd been there for generations. They had cherished traditions of local representative government. They had an aversion to being taxed by London. There was a powerful and distinct political culture in those colonies that set them apart ultimately from London. But in Nova Scotia, well, there was a majority of people who'd just recently arrived from Britain. They didn't really mind, therefore, London rule. They were kind of used to it. Also, Nova Scotia had only just been prized from the grip of its French owners. The British settlers there probably quite liked having British redcoats to keep the peace, to make sure both the French couldn't come back and indigenous people were controlled. It all felt a bit too real. Also, it was more difficult to get to. It wasn't connected by road to the other 13. To get there from the colonies meant a sea voyage, which meant it was sort of vulnerable to British naval interception. So George Washington was never, during the war, going to pack his entire army into ships and run the British naval gauntlet only to liberate the people of Nova Scotia. That's why Nova Scotia ultimately said no during the revolution, and also why the revolutionaries didn't try and spread the revolution by force to Nova Scotia. The American Revolution, the Canadians have said they do not wish to join in. They wish to remain part of the British Empire. But what about Canada proper, effectively modern Quebec, Ontario, Manitoba, etc.? Well, that was full of French people. They were Catholics. They'd only been conquered by the British Empire 15 or so years ago. The British realised they couldn't do another big ethnic cleanse across a whole massive sort of continental-sized region. And so they decided to live and let live. Their new French subjects, they could keep their own law, they'd keep their religion, they'd keep their language, they'd keep their customs. All they'd do was swear allegiance to King George, and they could go about their business. So when these American emissaries come knocking with all sorts of revolutionary ideas about separation of church and state and constitutions and whatnot, the Canadians, they're not sure about this. The Continental Congress actually sends a letter in French to the French speakers of Quebec. It was sent in late 1784. The Quebecers, these people living in Canada, were told that since they were now British, they needed to know that British people were blessed with inalienable rights. And the Americans listed, they enumerated these rights. It was representative government, the right to trial by jury, habeas corpus, land ownership, and the freedom of the press. So in this letter, they gave these French settlers a kind of crash course in Anglo-Saxon representative government. And the French residents were sort of, well, not entirely convinced, really. They faced a bit of a choice. They swapped distant, sort of pretty relaxed British rule for the Americans next door trying out lots of newfangled things. Americans who were known to be land-hungry. Americans who were known to be more Protestant than Martin Luther. Did these French Canadians feel kinship for a load of English-speaking Puritans from Massachusetts Bay? No, they did not. The American invitations fell pretty much on deaf ears. And the Americans tried again a few times. They sent further letters. They wrote in the summer of 1775, after the first battle of the Revolution, Lexington and Concord, "You and your wives and your children are made slaves." And they said, how could you be sure the British will respect your religious choice? How can you be sure that the Catholic Church will be protected? Because all that depends on a legislature in which you have no share, over which you have no control, which is a fair point. Parliament could revoke their offer to the French Canadians at any time they want. They can do whatever they like. Parliament is sovereign. And there would be nothing the French Canadians could do about it. Still, however, the French remained largely unconvinced, although some obviously were. There was a request for volunteers, the revolution, that was answered. There's about 2 battalions, so over 1,000 men would go to fight in Canadian units in the U.S. Continental Army as they battled the British. But Canada opted to remain alongside Nova Scotia. Newfoundland, they didn't join the revolution for similar reasons. They were too sparsely populated. There was no real culture of local politics by a well-established, independent-minded local elite. They lacked the political and civic mechanisms really to declare independence and join with these 13 colonies. So the 13 would go it alone. The American Revolution, the Canadians have said they do not wish to join in. They wish to remain part of the British Empire. That attempt to incorporate Canada within the US at the very moment of its birth, that attempt has failed. There would be a second opportunity for Canada. It wasn't long coming, and it was less a friendly invitation to join them. It was more a robust suggestion at the tip of a bayonet. Because in those early months of the war, as the New Englanders had been slapping the British military around outside Boston, a force of patriots, of rebels, had also pulled off a remarkable coup. They'd taken the supposedly impregnable, certainly very powerful fortress of Ticonderoga. And Ticonderoga is a gatekeeper. It sits athwart the traditional north-south invasion route from New England into Canada. So from Quebec and Montreal down towards Albany, the capital of New York State. Over the centuries, that is where armies had marched north and south. French, indigenous, British armies, you name it. Now they had Ticonderoga. What better way to strike at the British Empire than attack overland into Canada? The mighty Royal Navy couldn't really stop them. And the attack would put pressure on the British. They might agree to a negotiated peace. It might even convince the Canadians of the opportunities of joining the revolution. They could be the 14th state. There were very few British troops in Canada. It was thinly protected. It would be easy. So really, the first great offensive military operation in the history of the American Republic, in the history of the US military, is an invasion of Canada. And there would be two thrusts. The main one would go straight north from Ticonderoga, right up that old invasion highway, Lake Champlain to Montreal and beyond. And there'd be another strike across wilderness from Boston up into what is now Maine, and then traveling up a series of lakes and rivers to make their way to Quebec. And that involves savage portages, wild rapids, mountains, mosquito-infested swamps, untracked, deeply hostile terrain. A good proportion of the men deserted. The main thrust was quite successful. It captured Montreal. It demonstrated that this largely French-speaking militia, these farmers and townspeople that were turned out to protect the land in times of emergency, the militia, they weren't going to die for the British king. They made themselves scarce. The British commander had to escape from Montreal, dressed as a common folk person. He went to Quebec, the walled city, and there he rallied forces for what was to be a small, but really an extraordinarily consequential clash. 1,000 ragtag men here and there on either side, fighting basically for Canada. The Canada that's now the second largest country on earth, rich in raw materials. That's what was at stake in this campaign, with such small numbers of men on either side. Remarkably, these two American thrusts met up outside Quebec, and they did launch an assault that took place on New Year's Eve in a blizzard, a massive snowstorm. The Americans were utterly exhausted, diseased, malnourished. They lacked any specialist siege equipment. They didn't have the technical skills required for a siege on a city like Quebec. And they just threw themselves at the fortifications. They had little paper banners. They put little signs on their hats and they'd written liberty or death. And they hurled themselves into battle. This was the moment when dream of Canadian statehood probably came as close as it's ever been. The Americans were inside Quebec, the lower town in particular. They were meters away from the walls, the most significant British stronghold in Canada, the loss of which would see the other little forts and garrisons cut off from British support across the Atlantic and forced to surrender. This was the battle for Canada. But as we all know in history, a miss of a few meters or millimeters can be fatal. It can be determinative. And so it was for the brave Americans. They pushed their hopeless attack. Their commander, Richard Montgomery, was smashed at close range by grape shot, killed instantly. Dozens of small balls blasted out of a cannon as he was leading an assault, sword in hand, having personally hacked through a defensive stockade. Another leader, Benedict Arnold, attacking from a different direction, was wounded by a musket ball in the leg. Daniel Morgan took over. He climbed a scaling ladder up onto a barricade. He was set upon by British defenders, had to roll under a cannon to protect himself. He would end up being captured. That American force was utterly defeated, about half killed or captured. This tiny force now attempted to besiege Quebec. The British apparently sent out sex workers who they knew had smallpox. They sent them to the American camp, and so that beleaguered force then endured a smallpox epidemic. Through that tough winter and in their hardship, well, relations broke down with them and the Canadians, as you can imagine, because, unsurprisingly, the language of self-determination and the rights of freeborn Britons began to sound a bit hollow, began to pale to the French Canadians when this American invading army, desperate, starving, It was forced to take food and equipment, even to raise emergency taxes. So some French settlers would taunt them, saying, "Where's your taxation without representation now?" And they'd shout that at American troops as they came to commandeer food and fodder. As often we see through history, an occupying army is not a terrific diplomatic tool of persuasion. The Americans eventually gave up. They withdrew as British reinforcements flooded in the spring of the following year. That battle, what a moment in world history. Imagine a United States of America that stretches from the Gulf of America all the way up to Hudson's Bay, all the way up to the Arctic Circle, Baffin Island and beyond. And that almost came to be that New Year's Eve of 1775.
I'm Mark Vinette, and I hope you're enjoying the ride.